Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate you all turning out on this first day that really feels like winter here in Rhode Island. And thank you to everyone joining us on Zoom. I think a couple of people from the House of David archival team, among others, are joining us on Zoom. So welcome to all of you from Michigan as well as Rhode Island. I'm really excited. Okay, now for some reason, my slides aren't advancing. Let me try it this way. There we go. I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk to you about the research for my forthcoming book about the House of David, which is, you'll learn this afternoon, is this really unique and fascinating religious commune that was founded in Michigan, in Benton Harbor, Michigan in 1903. I've been kind of obsessed with the House of David for quite a few years now, and I came across it somewhat randomly by listening to a sports historian on NPR talking about the House of David baseball. And something told me this was a group I wanted to know more about. I had been looking for an opportunity to find a small, unusual, and not very well-known religious movement that I could use to tell a bigger story. And I realized that I found that in the House of David. So questions that I wanted to ask as I was writing this book about this unusual religious commune was very simply, who joined the House of David and what were their motives? Why were critics so determined to discredit the House of David as a false religion? As we'll see this afternoon, the House of David was beset by criticism and scandal almost from its earliest days, and detractors were really quite obsessive about trying to bring the House of David down. And I was really interested in why that was. And another really intriguing thing about the House of David is that it's the third longest lasting intentional community in American history. And I was really intrigued to find out, how did the House of David manage to beat the odds and overcome decades of scandal and criticism and litigation to become one of the longest lasting intentional communities in US history? The big story here is that the House of David holds some really interesting implications for the study of American religion, in terms of exploring both the possibilities and limits of religious toleration in the United States. You know, we're a nation that prides ourselves on our vaunted tradition of religious freedom, but the House of David shows both the limits and the possibilities of that promise. And it's also a really interesting case study in terms of debates over what is religion? How do you define religion, and who gets to make that definition? Here we have pictured Mary and Benjamin Purnell, who were the two prophets and founders of the House of David, with their friend and loyal supporter, Cora Mooney, who's seated in the car. And this is a car that's evidently decorated for the House of David to participate in the annual Blossom Time Festival in Benton Harbor, Michigan, every year. So you'll be seeing many more pictures of Mary and Benjamin Purnell. So let's talk about the Purnells. Here's a picture of them in their House of David years. In their earlier years, they would definitely not have been dressed this elegantly. So Mary and Benjamin Purnell were both Southerners. Mary was born in Virginia, Benjamin in Kentucky. Both grew up in Kentucky, and they met and married young, and it was actually Benjamin's second marriage, and they were religious seekers. They came from both very humble backgrounds. They were religious seekers and found out about a belief system called Christian Israelite theology. And this is a belief system that goes back to a British prophet of the late 18th, early 19th century England named Joanna Southcott, and evolved through a series of 5 subsequent prophets who were active in England, Australia, and the United States, among other places. Christian Israelites have a distinctive theology. They believe that they are assembling the remnants of the lost tribes of Israel into a new Jerusalem, and that this ingathering of 144,000 elect Christians will never die. And so this is something I want to emphasize. You know, all Christians believe in the possibility of immortality for the soul after death, but Christian Israelites believed that they were going to enjoy immortality of both body and soul. So it's a very distinctive form of Christian theology and very attractive to many believers. Well, the Purnell's belief in Christian Israelite theology brought them to a Detroit commune called the God House, which was run by a rather controversial leader named Michael Mills. And while they were there, Benjamin had a vision or a revelation that made him convinced that he was the seventh and final messenger in the Christian Israelite tradition, the person who would complete the prophecy and assemble the ingathering. And there is a lot of ambiguity within the house of David as to whether Benjamin alone or Benjamin and Mary together were the seventh messenger. And this is a kind of an internal theological dispute that would cause a lot of divisions later. Well, the Purnells' decision to declare themselves seventh messenger led to a new phase of their lives, and they left the Detroit God House and went on the road, and they spent 7 years on the road preaching Christian Israelite theology, writing furiously, spreading the word. Here's a very rare early picture of the Purnell family in their wagon that were carrying them around in their itinerant preacher days. And Benjamin is standing in front, and on top of the carriage, you see their children, Hetty and Coy. They ended up in a place called Pastoria, Ohio, where they found a temporary home. After years on the road, they settled in Pastoria. They found a small group of really fervent supporters and used their time there to write what became their magnum opus, The Star of Bethlehem. This is an almost 800-page religious treatise and only one of many religious writings, but it's their most well-known. It's really the core of their faith. Well, they didn't stay too long in Pastoria because of a tragic accident. Their daughter Hetty had gone to work in a fireworks factory and was killed by in an explosion. And because Christian Israelite theology doesn't really believe in death, there are prescriptions on handling of the dead. So the local townspeople were really distressed by what appeared to be the heartless way in which they responded to Hetty's death and the non-traditional way in which they responded. They realized they were no longer welcome in town and they needed a new home, and they found it in Benton Harbor, Michigan. So here, right here. So it's a little town, little city on the shore of Lake Michigan in southwestern Michigan. If you go further west, you'll get to the nearest more substantial city is Kalamazoo. Continue a couple hours west, you get to Ann Arbor and Detroit. So just to situate you on where this is located. And Benton Harbor was a really great location. It's located in what's known as Michigan's fruit belt, this really productive farming area known for its bumper crops of apples, peaches, blueberries. It was also a major resort area. Benton Harbor and St. Joseph, which were known as Michigan's twin cities, were a really popular summer resort area. People, it could be accessed by railroad or by steamship. A lot of tourists would come across the lake from Chicago as well as other places and enjoy the beautiful beaches. There was a local amusement park, mineral springs. It became a very popular area. So it had this cachet, and it turned out to be a pretty fantastic location for the House of David. And here's a picture of a ship arriving from Milwaukee in neighboring St. Joseph in 1896. Well, to be a member of the House of David was to make a bargain. Um, you had to surrender all your assets, work for no wages in the colony's complex business enterprises. You had to give up sex, hair cutting, meat, and traditional family ties. Generally, although there were some exceptions to this, families didn't live together. Men and women lived separately, and children lived with other children in supervised dormitory style living once they were about 6 years old. So this is what you gave up, and in return, you got the promise of community, economic security at a time of great economic stability in the American economy. So this appeal of economic security, community at a time of disorienting cultural change, and of course, importantly, the promise of immortality. And one of many intriguing aspects of the House of David is that on the one hand, it was providing a respite, an escape from the modern industrial capitalism. It was a refuge for people who were feeling buffeted by changes in both the manufacturing and the agricultural sectors. But it also was really quite brilliant and engaging with the opportunities offered by the modern economy. And there was the House of David had a brilliant business model in which, people turned over their assets, they worked for no wages, and they had their needs met. So it was able to undercut a lot of competitors because it had no labor costs, right? So it was a smart business model. The House of David had extensive farms, as I mentioned. It was located in Michigan's fruit belt. So thriving farms owned some of the region's choicest farmland. One product they became known for were House of David jellies and jams, pictured here. But interestingly, entertainment was a really important part of their business model. So here too, you see this interesting kind of uh, dual nature of the House of David. It was, as all communes are, it was a separated community, separated out from mainstream culture, trying to avoid the vices and the problems of mainstream society. But it also eagerly embraced the popular culture of the early 20th century. And it was very famous for an amusement park, Eden Springs Amusement Park, which had opened in 1908. And here is a picture of the entrance to Eden Springs. And I don't know how well you can see it, but this is the Eden Depot. People would be deposited at the entrance to Eden Springs, and then they take these little miniature railroads pictured here through the park. So riding on the miniature railroads was a big part of the fun. And they still actually, there are people who today have restored the railroads. And if you go out during the summer, you can take a ride on the miniature railroad still today. But Eden Springs was, formed at a time when, amusement parks were proliferating nationwide, famous examples like Coney Island and Luna Park. The House of David at their amusement park, you could play arcade games, bowl, swim, go to a vegetarian restaurant. They had a huge concert stage where their bands and orchestras, which I'll talk more about in a moment, would play. They had a 3,500 seat baseball stadium. So it was really quite an extensive facility. And they claimed that by about the 1915 or so, they estimated that about 300,000 tourists a summer were coming to Eden Springs. So it was a big draw. Here's a picture of the Eden Springs stage. And this is clearly one of the House of David's ladies' bands. And you can tell from the way the women are dressed, it's probably a picture from the 1920s. And you just get a sense of the crowds there and how many people turned out to see this and many other musical, vaudeville, Wild West shows, animal shows, like a whole big variety of types of entertainment you could access at Eden Springs. The House of David became famous for its traveling orchestras and jazz bands. And pictured here is Chick Bell, one of the most famous Israelites, as they called them. The members of the House of David called themselves the Israelites. He was an Australian immigrant who was part of a very musical family. In 1905, about a group of 85 Australians from Melbourne came over together to join the House of David. The Christian Israelite tradition was very strong in Australia. And so this big group came over, and a number of them were very talented musicians and musical entrepreneurs. And they brought this tradition with them. And Benjamin and Mary recognized that this is something very special we're going to cultivate. So families like the Bell family and the Hannaford family helped create this extraordinary music program at the House of David. All children in the colony had to, once they turned age 10, had to learn an instrument. There were a whole variety of bands, men's, women's, children's bands, orchestras, jazz bands, and they were really quite famous. This is one of my favorite House of David pictures of one of the men's bands, and you could see their long hair, which was a very distinctive part of their identity and their appeal. And it was common in a performance for the men to start the performance with their backs to the audience, so everyone could really see and appreciate their long hair, and then, you know, maybe start by playing a more solemn religious tune, and then they turn around and break into a lively jazz or ragtime number, and audiences just loved them. They toured all over the country, places like Broadway, the Cotton Club, Hollywood, New Orleans. They went everywhere, and they were really famous. Here's a picture of one of the ladies groups, and I had to include this because I love their headdresses. I just think this is a great picture. The House of David was equally famous for its barnstorming baseball teams. Benjamin strongly encouraged members to be, physically active, and to, baseball may have been kind of a physical outlet for a celibate population, as well as just a fun, great way to pass the time and relax after working hours were over. So the House of David started off kind of small in the 1910s with its baseball program, which quickly accelerated and became a really big deal nationwide by the 1920s. They were semi-pro barnstorming baseball teams. They were, by all accounts, quite good baseball players, as well as great entertainers. And here's a picture of three of the most famous House of David baseball players, the trio of Anderson, Tucker, and Talley. And they were known for their pepper game, which in between innings, they would kind of fool around on the baseball field, and they would toss the ball back and forth so quick you almost couldn't see it. It was so quick. And then the ball would disappear and no one would know where it went. And one of the players would produce the ball out of his long bushy beard. And the crowds loved the pepper game and other House of David antics. So between the amusement park, the musical program, the baseball teams, the House of David was very closely integrated into the popular culture of the early 20th century. And I also just wanted to include this. It was also, there are a number of very talented House of David artists. And one very visible way in which they contributed to the community is every year they would create these elaborate cars and floats for the annual Blossom Time Festival that celebrated the region's agricultural bounty. And the House of David had a really good greenhouse. So you see this car is decorated with flowers from the House of David greenhouse. So how many people were there? Membership peaked at about 1,100 during the First World War. And over time, probably about 2,000 people joined the House of David between its founding in 1903 and the 1960s, when things started to kind of slow down. And I like this picture because it features a cart pushed by John Wheeler and his family, who walked and pushed this cart 1,200 miles from I think it was Arkansas to Benton Harbor, preaching the gospel along the way. And it was just an indication of how badly a lot of people wanted to join this distinctive religious commune. So who were the Israelites, as they called themselves? I did an analysis based on the 1920 census. So these numbers are based on House of David members listed in the 1920 census, and I found that membership skewed young and male, and this is a little bit unusual to have a majority male commune. A lot of communal experiments had a majority female membership, especially those that embraced celibacy. So this is kind of interesting. Mostly working and middle class, although some very privileged people joined and made huge contributions, but it was basically a working middle class membership. It was entirely white. Christian Israelite theology held that the promise of bodily immortality was available only for white people. And I could have given my entire talk on that. And if you're interested in talking about that more in the Q&A, I would be happy to talk more about that. About 2/3 of the Israelites were from the United States, the majority Southern Midwestern, and then a third foreign born. So there was a substantial immigrant population with largest numbers from Australia, England, and Germany. And again, as I said, the Israelite tradition had been very strong in Australia and England before migrating to the United States. I'm just going to skip the next two slides in the interest of time. So why did people join the House of David? Why did they travel so far, give up so much, strike this bargain? Obviously, the most, that we have to start with faith. You can tell by the members' testimonials that they had a fervent, deeply rooted faith in Christian Israelite theology and an eagerness for this exceptional promise of immortality. So first and foremost, religious faith. The search for community and economic security at a time of enormous disruption and change in the United States and globally. Industrialization, the rise of big business, disruptions to older ways of living and working, migration, immigration, urbanization. The House of David provided this nurturing community at a time of disorienting change. Members talked a lot about the appeal of clean living. If you read their testimonials, a lot of people use the word clean to describe the House of David. And they were not only trying to rid themselves of sin in preparation to achieve immortality, but they also were separating themselves from what they perceived to be the pollution of the surrounding society. And I just like this picture of these women dressed in their virginal white. It sort of illustrates this, projects this notion of innocence and purity. I think a really intriguing part of the House of David's appeal was that it provided members with an opportunity to participate in modern popular culture at a safe distance. They were running an amusement park, performing on stages all over the country, playing baseball all over the country and abroad. But they were doing so within the protective cocoon of the House of David. So it was a way to interact with mainstream culture in a way that members of intentional communities don't always do, but within kind of safe limits. And this is one of my favorite House of David pictures. This is of one of the ladies' bands from the 1920s. And you'll notice they're wearing they don't look like members of a separated religious community. They're very fashionable. They're wearing the fashions of the day. They have the fashionable haircuts. I actually asked people at the House of David about the hair. I was confused. How do they have bobbed hair if they weren't supposed to cut their hair? And apparently they did it. They had long hair, but they became very skilled at rolling their hair up so it looked like it was bobbed. So they were honoring the rules of their commune, but looking like the fashionable young ladies of the 1920s. The House of David offered women roles that few of them had access to in mainstream society. On the one hand, the House of David did operate using a traditional gender division of labor to a large extent, but there were also prominent roles available for really talented and motivated women. And women were key in running the business end of the House of David. There were a number of women, such as including Edith Meldrum, the wife of the aforementioned Chick Bell, the band leader, the famous cornetist. There were a number of women who had very prominent roles within the House of David that would have been denied to them in most sectors of mainstream society. And women were also on the road as missionaries, as members of orchestral groups and jazz bands and choral groups, like the Sunshine Trio, as they were known, pictured here. And I also want to emphasize the special appeal of celibacy and communal housekeeping for women at this time. You know, for early 20th century women, sex was not a great deal, right? Marriage was not always a great deal. No legal birth control, no legal abortion, large families, high infant and maternal mortality. So I think this is, helps to explain why a number of celibate communes have been, over time, have been majority female. So the way the commune was organized with the celibate lifestyle and the communal housekeeping was very attractive for women who joined. Despite all these really notable and commendable aspects of life in the House of David and all the great reasons people had to be members of this commune, it was also a very scandal-ridden group. It was very conflicted. There was this sort of playful side and this dark side. And the House of David was the target of critics really almost from its earlier days. Some critics were disaffected members who understandably perhaps regretted their decision to turn over all their assets to the commune. And when they did so, they had to sign contracts that they could never recover those assets. So some people, traveled from across the country, across the world, got there, turned everything over and realized, oh, this is not what I expected. And so some of them filed lawsuits trying to get their money back. A few succeeded, but really not so much. There were professional rivals who were very jealous of the House of David. Local ministers who were a little concerned to see the rapid growth of this newfangled religious commune, economic rivals who found themselves undercut by a religious organization that didn't have to pay labor costs. And the local community was very ambivalent toward the House of David. On the one hand, there was the sense of rivalry, but on the other hand, the town of Benton Harbor really liked the House of David because it was good for business. They put Benton Harbor on the map. They made it famous. They contributed enormously to the local economy. So there was a definite ambivalence there. A number of people complained about things like living conditions. You can see here the House of David was very nice. It was very beautiful, quite grand, architecture, beautifully landscaped gardens. Members appeared in all the official photographs and postcards, very, very nicely dressed. But there were a number of critics who complained, especially in the early years of the colony when things were probably a lot rougher. Conditions were rougher as the colony was building. They claimed, they were inadequately clothed, fed, complained about a double standard in which the Purnells lived much more lavishly than their followers. There were concerns about the colony school. So House of David children, those who, of course, no children were supposed to be born once at the House of David, but entire families would join. So the colony children went to a colony school, and there were a lot of concerns about the quality of education there. People in kind of a precursor to the brainwashing charges leveled at American cults in the 1970s. There were people who claimed the Purnells and their associates were closely monitoring information, reading correspondence and all that. So there were this kind of concern here. Here's a picture of the children in the colony school. But most damaging were repeated accusations that Benjamin was a sexual predator. And quite a few young women came forward and claimed that even though the colony was supposed to be celibate, Benjamin was convincing them to have sex with him on the argument that this would ensure both their immortality and his. So there were a number of lawsuits filed. I want to, emphasize that Benjamin was never criminally charged or convicted on any of these statutory rape charges, but these accusations were the source of multiple litigation and the undercurrent of civil lawsuits also filed against the House of David. So you can see that here he is, wearing white, projecting this image of purity, of wholesomeness, but there were a lot of rumors and charges about what was going on behind the scenes. And this culminated in two really high-profile lawsuits in the 1920s. And there was absolutely obsessive level of press coverage. And interestingly, the House of David saved all the coverage, even no matter how damaging. I mean, they have an extraordinary archive that includes, hundreds of articles of in the local press, regional, even the national press, even even newspapers like the New York Times would occasionally cover what was going on. And these lawsuits of the 1920s kind of focused on two questions. Was Benjamin guilty of the sexual charges against him? And was the House of David a fraud? Was it a true religion or was it a fraudulent?
Season to catch up with some Moose alumni. We heard from Max Fortunas when we were down in Texas.
Okay.
Some current.
That person. Thank you. The lawsuits reveal what I call the Rashomon like nature of life at the House of David. Whenever I'm doing this research, I kept thinking of the Japanese film Rashomon, in which the same story is presented from a number of different perspectives. And that's kind of the way the accounts of the House of David read. You read these lawsuits and there's extensive records, legal records, as for historians to delve into. And the critics are depicting the House of David as this den of iniquity, this harem heaven, the headlines and depicting Benjamin as the leader of this harem where he has, dozens, scores of young women imprisoned and, in this these drunken orgies, it's really, really dark. And then you have members stepping up to defend the House of David using terms like, this is heaven on earth. This is the cleanest, most wholesome place in the world to live. We are the happiest class of people in the world. So it's really hard to sort fact from fiction and get at the truth of what life was like in the House of David. So a question that really interested me as I was doing this research was, why were people willing to believe even the wildest rumors about the House of David? Why were they willing to shift from what may have been very reasonable complaints and grounded complaints by a number of young women to believe these press stories about, Benjamin having this huge harem, having like 80 women, in his harem at a time, sleeping with hundreds of girls in a colony that never topped 1,100 people. If you do this, you get into the research, like the claims are really, really wild. And one factor, of course, was this was an age of where there was a rise in a national media culture, sensational press, a lot of high-profile sensational trials. The 1920s also saw the famous Scopes monkey trial of 1925, the Sacco and Vanzetti trials. This was a decade when people were really eager for sensational news coverage and coverage in particular of these high-profile trials. It's It's also really important to note that the House of David was challenging social norms in so many ways, right? Living communally, living celibately, not living in traditional family arrangements, challenging dominant social, domestic, sexual mores. And this was at a time when Americans were really concerned about a disruption to social stability. And particularly, there was a lot of press coverage about the fears of white slavery. That was a term you heard a lot, the fate of unprotected young white women moving away from their farms and their villages and their families and being victimized in the big city. So there's like a lot of rhetoric about that. There's also a long-term, really interesting pattern of critics seeking to discredit new religions on the charges of sexual deviancy. So if you study new religions and you study communal societies, you see a very clear pattern of challenges to sexual mores. Some of these groups are celibate, some are polygamous or polyamorous. There's like a whole range of alternate sexual practices at a lot of communes and new religions. These are not necessarily exploitative, but it's as a historian who studies this, Megan Goodwin has argued, she's done some really interesting work on how charges of sexual abuse are really effective ways to discredit religions that are on new religions on the margins of society. Another factor in kind of understanding the depth and the furor behind the scandal surrounding the House of David was that it didn't look to most people like a religion. The House of David didn't fit popular conceptions of what a religion should look like, conceptions shaped by the dominant Protestant and Catholic models of religiosity. The House of David didn't have an ordained ministry. It didn't have formal services, rites, and sacraments. It did have sacred texts, very much so, like the House, the Star of Bethlehem, and so many others. There were services, but it wasn't formal. People weren't required to go if they had to work on the farm or in the amusement park on a Sunday. That was okay. They weren't expected to attend the service. The House of David used Sunday as a day of business, which was controversial. So in so many ways, and this was an argument I really focus on throughout the book, is it attracted a lot of suspicion because it didn't fit popular definitions of what a religion should look like. And to many people, it looked like a business posing as a religion for the tax breaks. That was a frequent criticism. And I just included this picture of a vaudeville act from the Eden Springs stage, is just kind of getting at the senses. Does this really look like a religion? It very much was. It absolutely was a religion and a sincere faith, but to outsiders, it didn't really look that way. So, nonetheless, building on all these concerns, in the final and really conclusive lawsuit of 1927, the House of David was declared a fraud. About a month later, Benjamin, who had been in very poor health for years, died. And the colony split in between those loyal to his widow, Mary, and to this man pictured here, H.G. Dewhurst, who was a lawyer who had joined the House of David in 1920 and quickly risen through the ranks to become Benjamin's most trusted lieutenant. And this led to a split between the two colonies in 1930. And I'm going to wrap up now because I want to leave time for questions. And I know some people have to leave to get to a 1 o'clock class or 2 o'clock class or other event. But I just want to say that this so easily could have been the death knell for the House of David. The lost lawsuit, which was later overturned, Benjamin's death and the split into two. And remarkably, the two colonies regrouped and thrived well into the 60s and still exist today as a tiny remnant. There is one member left in the breakoff Mary City of David, and two people left in the original House of David. So it's a really interesting story of religious survival and communal survival despite the odds. So I'll stop there and ask if you have any questions. Catherine? Okay, so okay, so the question, I'll repeat the question so the people on the Zoom can hear. So the question about the theology of immortality and how to justify it when people passed away. Yeah, so the idea was, yeah, theoretically, one would achieve immortality if one was, you know, deeply adhered to the faith and was celibate, vegetarian, and so forth. But then, yes, there's a potential crisis of disconfirmation. When Benjamin died in 1953, Mary died, many members died, and the explanations, you know, religious groups are very good at finding explanations to, you know, when the promise of the religion appears to be disconfirmed. So explanations were in some cases, well, maybe the person wasn't fully in the faith that they died, or they've died temporarily, but they'll come back as sort of ministering spirit. So they were kind of laying the foundation for the ingathering of people who will be immortal. In the case of Benjamin and Mary dying, it was believed that they would be resurrected. Rafia?
It reminded me of scandal that happened in Nigeria with pastor who had their organization, which really that is your died and it's interesting to say the question of what did we have to do with the body?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
So what actually happens?
Oh, yeah, good question. So the question is about what happened to the bodies of the deceased. So the House of David did not believe in the rituals of death. People would be buried in, you know, unmarked graves in a nearby burial plot. There wouldn't be a funeral service. As time went on, this sort of relaxed a little bit, and certainly there are like elaborate burials were, you know, the facilities were created for Benjamin and Mary. Benjamin still lies in, his body is still in the colony's Diamond House, and Mary is buried in a mausoleum on the City of David grounds. So, but there were, yeah, very, very few rituals really none surrounding death, because this was a serious prescription in Christian Israelite theology. Oh, yes. That's also a great question that I wasn't able to get to. Yeah, if you came married, you could join the House of David with your family, but you would then, in most cases, live separately. And no new marriage was supposed to be permitted, but in 1910, the House of David changed that policy and allowed members to wed as long as they promised to remain celibate. And there was a series of group marriages, and this was one thing that issue that really aroused suspicion, because a lot of people believed that the group marriages were an effort to cover Benjamin's tracks. The idea, you know, being this interpretation held that, well, if a young woman was discovered to have lost her virginity because of Benjamin, she could say, well, actually, I violated the vow of celibacy with my husband. But when couples married, they still lived separately. So it was unusual to say the least. And after the 1930s, when some of the rules relaxed somewhat, married couples were allowed to live together, but they were still expected to be celibate. Okay. Yeah.
Proselytizing did they do? Because they have to keep bringing in new members.
Yeah, the question is about how did they proselytize? So they had a monthly newspaper called Shiloh's Messenger that they sent out. They had teams of missionaries who spanned out across the country, overseas as well. So they had an active missionary effort and a lot of literature they would send out, including their newspaper and all their, and you could get the newspaper that you could write in and request to be sent the religious writings. And if you read enough of the Purnell's writings and could demonstrate a deep commitment to the faith, you were allowed to join. Yes, people were allowed to leave. Yeah. There was no prescriptions on leaving the colony, but if you left, you would leave with no assets. Like you might get, say, train fare to get, a little bit, maybe $10 in train fare to get to where you wanted to be. Andrea?
So the children who were brought there, were they able to emancipate themselves or and did you follow up? I know you did oral history with some of them.
Yeah, well, a lot of the children left. There were some people who, came to have the House of David as children and were there for the rest of their lives. There were other individuals who stayed a few weeks, a few months and left. But there was, once young people reached adulthood, there were quite a few who left. And a lot of them in their testimonials talk about just the difficulty of being celibate, as you would imagine, and adhering to the colony rules. And a lot of people really struggled with it and wanted to keep the faith, and they just couldn't do it. What's interesting is that a lot of people left with useful skills. The colony had such extensive business operations, and not just all the farming and the entertainment ventures that I mentioned, but so many there was such a complex internal operation of, crafts and artisanal work and businesses that a lot of people developed a skill that they could then use when they left the colony. Yeah.
Two things. I can't help but think, you put up a slide and it said appeal. I couldn't help but think that everything you were mentioning reminded me of what's going on in the politics today. That was one thing. And then at the beginning, you said you were going to talk about what is religion?
Oh, yeah, okay.
That was nowhere in the talk.
Well, I touched upon that at the end when I talked about how the House of David, but thank you for bringing this up. The question is what is religion and how the House of David exemplifies that. Yeah, I touched upon that briefly when I mentioned that the major problem the House of David encountered was that it didn't fit definitions of what religion was supposed to look like. It didn't fit a Protestant or a Catholic model of a religion with an ordained ministry, elaborate place of worship, a series of sacraments and rites and ritualized services. And so all this debate over was the House of David really a religion touched on this big question of, well, how do you define religion? And this is, a challenge that a number of non-Protestant or non-Catholic religions have encountered. A lot of Native American religions have been dismissed as not really religion because they don't fit that Christian model. And a lot of them have had to adapt and sort of Christianize their practices in many ways in order to be accepted as legitimate. So it's I think a really fascinating and central question in religious history and religious studies is, well, how do you define religion, and who gets to make that decision? It's a question with all sorts of really interesting legal implications. And I teach a class on religious freedom in America, and we have such interesting discussions on this question is, how do you define religion, and who gets to set those boundaries? Vincent?
Following up on that, and one is still from Supreme Court decisions, some word and definition, the legal sense of religion.
So the question is, can you, based on has the Supreme Court issued guidelines as to what constitutes religion? A lot of it hinges on the sincerity test. Are the beliefs of this group sincerely held? And there have been differences also between regulating religious belief and religious behavior. So, for example, Mormon polygamists, there was a really high profile late 19th century case called Reynolds versus the United States, in which Mormon was convicted on the basis of being a polygamist, and the Supreme Court basically said, you can believe whatever you want, but you can't engage in practices that violate the laws of the land in the name of religion. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's such a good question that I didn't get to touch on. So the question is, what did Jews think of the House of David? So the House of David tried very hard to reach out to Jews. They wanted to bring Jews and Christians together into this Christian Israelite religion. They didn't really succeed. There was, I think I only came across a couple of Jews that lived in Mary, city of David, briefly in the 30s. But interestingly, once Mary formed her breakoff colony in 1930, one source of income was that she created a summer resort catering to Jewish vacationers, and she built a synagogue. They liked the vegetarian restaurants because you could keep kosher in a vegetarian restaurant. So there was a lot of, in the later years, a lot of interaction between Mary and particularly one congregation of Chicago Jews who would come over every summer to go to what was called Paradise Park. But in terms of Jewish members, Jews were not interested in joining the House of David.
Did they have any groups that were actively against them?
Oh, you mean organized groups as opposed to a lot of individuals?
Both.
Well,
people saying you're not a religion, or what are you doing, or.
Well, yeah, I mean, there was a tremendous criticism of both disaffected insiders who left and outside critics saying, this is not really a religion. This looks like a business. We think the House of David is an elaborate business operation posing as a religion for the tax breaks. And
So they had tax breaks?
yes, it's very
that
difficult.
time?
It's very difficult to ascertain the tax status of the House of David, and Brian Zebart at the House of David, who's been extraordinarily helpful in this research. He spent some time trying to figure it out for me. And it looks like they paid property taxes, but not federal taxes. But then that changed in the 1920s after some legal defeats. Then they had to start paying federal taxes. But then in the mid-30s, there were new tax codes created that created some tax breaks for nonprofit corporations. So the tax question is interesting. It's a little hard to pin down.
Did you know some, I mean, in Benton, since they were such a big presence in Benton, any of them that were run for office?
Oh, yeah.
Get elected, or they have any kind of representation in government?
Yeah, the question is about, did they run for office or have representation in government? No, I didn't come across any House of David members running for office. However, they were very cozy with local officials. As I mentioned, the Benton Harbor as a whole loved the House of David because they brought in so much money to the town. And they were also seen as really good neighbors. There was all the controversy surrounding Benjamin, but all the other Israelites were seen as really good neighbors, good citizens, people who were industrious, hardworking, contributing to the health of the community. So Benjamin and the House of David in general did have influence in local politics, but I don't think any of them ever ran for office. Oh, one exception, Dewhurst, pictured here, who became the leader of the House of David after Benjamin died, he ran for Congress in the mid-30s. He wasn't successful, but he did make a bid for office.
He a judge before?
Yeah, he was a judge in California who then gave that up to bring his family to the House of David. Oh, Catherine, was that a question?
I'm passing my question over to Matt. You had your hand up at one point.
Oh, sorry, Matt.
No, that's okay. No, I was just wondering, we were talking about the legal status and all that kind of stuff. What was the key issue in the lawsuit? Like, why, what did the lawsuit turn on as to why it was declared a fraud? And then what was the issue that overturned it? Do you know?
Oh, okay, so the question is, what was the key issue in the 1927 lawsuit that declared the House of David a fraud, and why was it overturned? So it turned on this question of whether the House of David was a fraud. I mean, there were a lot of charges about living condition, education, the sexual charges against Benjamin, but it kind of came down to, was this a real religion,
So
or had
it was the question of whether it was a real.
yeah, and had the House of David defrauded, hundreds and over thousands of people into turning over all their assets for a false promise. And the judge declared, even though the judge dismissed some of the charges, he said, yeah, this is a fraudulent institution. But then interestingly, Benjamin died, and then 2 years later, the lawsuit was overturned. And I think because so much of the underlying issues had been the sexual charges about Benjamin's sexual behavior, once he died, the judge said, I think the problem's been solved. And interestingly, after Benjamin died, there were no more scandals. There were no more lawsuits. There was one lawsuit involving Mary's group in the late 30s, but that was a theological issue, not a moral or a financial issue, really. Any other?
I do have one last question.
Sure.
Not just to the House of David, which we studied at the beginning, but to studying, religion and this, what fascinates you about the study of religion?
What fascinates me about the study of religion, I'm just so fascinated by trying to understand belief systems that I don't embrace myself, and trying to figure out what inspires people to embrace particular belief systems, and what people get out of being members of a religious community. Not obviously, faith is a significant part of it, but I've always been really interested in all my research about what are the motivations and what benefits do people derive from being members of a religious community. So, well, thank you all so much for coming, and thanks to the people who joined us on Zoom.